Thank you, Cynthia. Good morning. There's a little bit of it left. I feel very privileged to be here today and spend some time with you talking about something that I think is very important. The focus today is going, at least for me, is going to be an approach to policing that's intended to make the job of a police officer more effective and more rewarding. And that approach is called procedural justice. And that's a way of simply saying that the police should treat the public in a fair, caring, and respectful fashion. In the first part of a tag team, Chief Hassan Aden will follow me and tell you, if you like the ideas, how to get people to do them. So he's got the hard job. I've got the easy job of just telling you about it. Talking a little bit about the evidence that is available on procedural justice, and also the evidence that's not available and that hopefully you might be engaged in at some point, as Renee was talking about, in generating information, knowledge, and insight into whether to do it, when to do it, and how to do it better. This is what I'm going to cover today. We're going to talk a little bit about defining procedural justice, look how it's supposed to work. We'll very briefly talk about the scientific evidence. I won't go into it in much detail. We'll spend some time then trying our hand at applying the concepts of procedural justice in a video-based exercise if the technology gods favor us and I can make this work. And finally, we'll discuss very briefly, sort of segueing to Chief Aden, ways that you might consider pursuing if you decide, or your agency decides, that you want to promote it. So, what is procedural justice? It focuses on how police interact with members of the public. So it's the answer yes to the question, has the police decision process been fair? Have the procedures been fair? When the public feels that the process has been fair, they're more likely to accept the outcome of that process, even if that outcome is not favorable to them. For example, the issue in procedural justice is not whether to make an arrest. That's a whole separate issue. But it's how the arrest was made that really shapes what we're talking about in terms of procedural justice. Another example, for procedural justice, it's not which party in a domestic dispute gets what they want, but how the officer communicates her decision to them about what they get or don't get. It's important to note that citizens' judgments about the fairness of police treatment are entirely separate from their judgments about the effectiveness of the outcome. So even when police need to do something that is unpleasant for citizens, the delivery of that experience can be performed in a way that citizens will be less negative about it. Why is procedural justice so important? It's easier for members of the public to make judgments about whether the police actions at the scene seem fair than it is to judge whether they were effective. So, for example, it's very difficult for a domestic violence victim to know with confidence what the impact of the officer's decision to arrest or not arrest the offender will be down the road. It's hard for any of us to predict that. And it's also difficult for a citizen to know whether, because we're always concerned about justice, is the officer treating me the same way that he would treat another citizen similarly situated? It's hard to know because that citizen is not following the officer around to see. But all citizens feel very comfortable. They know how they would like to be treated ideally, and they can compare how that officer is treating them to their expectation. And so that's something they do rely on. So the bottom line here on procedural justice can be taken from a familiar sports adage. Citizens are influenced by what police officers tell them to do, rather than citizens are less influenced by what officers tell them to do than by how they tell them to do it. How the police play the game is what matters here. So let's dig a little bit deeper into this thing called procedural justice, and how would we know it when we see it? Here are the elements that are up here on the screen for you, and I'll just take a minute or two to explain them very briefly. Participation is really all about giving the citizen an opportunity, even encouraging the citizen to explain his or her side of the story, to tell their side of the story. Most of us know that there's a strong compulsion, and particularly if you're a police officer, you know that citizens like to have their say. They like to be able to tell you their perspective on the problem. And so procedural justice says the rule is that the officer should allow and even encourage citizens to give their perspective. A second principle of procedural justice is neutrality. Here the idea is that the officer needs to convey, to communicate, to signal the ways in which he or she is being neutral, not personally biased, not basing a decision based on what I like or don't like about people generally, but about the legitimate things that police officers should be making their decisions on. So typically this is being transparent about why did I make this arrest? I'm going to tell the offender. Or why didn't I do this when the victim asked me to do this or that? In other words, so you're being transparent, you're explaining things. The third thing probably doesn't need a lot of discussion here is dignity or respect. Police are polite and they acknowledge people and follow people's rights. And finally, trustworthy motives. You get the citizen in a positive frame of mind by showing that you care about the welfare of the citizen's well-being, and beyond that, the broader societal impact of whatever's going on, so society's well-being as well. Now, it's important to keep in mind that procedural justice is all about communicating or signaling being fair and respectful. So an officer could have a very good justification for doing what he or she thinks is the right thing. It could be excellent. But in procedural justice, you don't get any points unless you communicate that to the citizen. That has to be communicated. Renee was talking all about the importance of communication, how often we fail. This is important. If it isn't communicated, it doesn't occur. If it's in the officer's head and stays there and doesn't get articulated, then the citizen can't very well know it. Now, there are two ways to think about these elements of procedural justice. One way is a simple set of practical communication techniques that are useful for manipulating citizens' perceptions of the situation. That's one way. Another way is to treat it as a philosophical guide to how police should relate to citizens they encounter. So here are some of the typical practical communication guides that are offered. And here you treat procedural justice skills as any other set of skills, like how to operate traffic radar, how to make an arrest, how to use martial arts, and so on. And so you train officers, and here are some techniques you can use, and here's how you do it. The motivation behind this is you use these skills because it makes your job easier. They're a means to an end. But there's also an alternative approach that I mentioned, which is philosophical. And here, this is what I would regard as the philosophy that captures the reasoning behind procedural justice. Another way to say it, as I've heard it said to me many times by experienced patrol officers, is that you treat somebody out there the way you would want officers to treat your mother or someone near and dear to you. Whether you emphasize procedural justice as a communication skill or a philosophical orientation is important. You can go either way or both. If you treat it as strictly skill-based approach, then what you're trying to do is to sell it to officers as a useful tool. Now, this means that you have a chance, maybe with some pretty crusty officers, pretty skeptical, to convince them, just try it and see if you like the impact. And then, in that way, you treat the communications skills as a set of do's and don'ts. Now, this approach doesn't exactly, as I think many of you know, stimulate a lot of creativity in officers. It's simply a bunch of guidelines. If I follow this, then the chances are things will work out a little bit better. But it may well bring up the average if you can get people to do it simply as a set of do's and don'ts. Now, the alternative approach is that I mentioned is the philosophy approach. Now, this is a harder sell. It's like trying to change somebody's religion, particularly if they've been practicing it a while. And so, to begin with, treating procedural justice as a philosophy is going to be more challenging. On the other hand, if you do convert the officer to this or bring them over to your line, to this way of thinking, that person will probably be more reliable, more motivated, and more creative in figuring out how to practice procedural justice well. So just something to think about which approach or approaches you want to take. So how does it work in theory? Very briefly, what police do affects how citizens feel and think, which affects their behavior. So procedural justice increases a citizen's sense by communicating a fair and respectful process, increases the sense of police legitimacy, that police are proper, that they're doing what they ought to be doing, they're just. And so I'm, as a citizen, obliged voluntarily out of this sense of legitimacy to comply, and ultimately I will and I'll cooperate, and down the road I'll even be more inclined to obey the law. That's how it's supposed to work. So, where do opportunities for procedural justice arise? Just about anywhere police and the public interact. And by the way, procedural justice also applies within an organization as well, but I'm not going to be talking about that today. So how the sergeant and the officers treat each other, how the chief and so on, all those interactions, this also applies to them, but we're going to focus on just police-citizen interactions. The evidence, very briefly summarized. In the last 20 years, a lot of studies have looked at the impact of procedural justice, and as this slide indicates, the results are quite positive. The more procedural justice the police display, the greater the likelihood of desirable results such as citizen satisfaction and trust in the police, citizens viewing the police as legitimate, citizens being more compliant and cooperative, less resistant, and citizens showing down the road a reduced risk of reoffending. This effect has not been demonstrated as being quite so strong. It's a little bit more difficult to show, although I just reviewed an article for publication in a journal that suggested that the effect is fairly strong. What's not to like about this? Well, here's a balance sheet for you. On the left side of this are the things that I just reviewed that scientific evidence suggests exist. It's not, in science we never say we've proven anything forever. So I want to be cautious in that regard. But almost all the scientific evidence is very positive in this regard. But on the right are the things that we don't know, or we don't know very much about. And these are the risks. And quite frankly, they're very important. So I'm not a used car salesman. I'm not telling you this thing is perfect and all the kinks have been worked out. It'll never give you any problems. Some of the things we don't know about, for example, officer safety. Does engaging in procedural justice expose officers sometimes to greater risk? Maybe, we don't know. Are some citizens immune to the presumed effects of procedural justice? I've heard many officers say there are some citizens who don't get the message, who don't hear, who don't respond. Quite possible, quite likely. We don't know how much that's the case. Does procedural justice take more time? It might. Can officers abuse it? Yes. We've observed some officers who violated citizen search and seizure rights in the nicest sort of way, consistent with procedural justice. In fact, it was a mechanism, I'm sure none of you have ever observed this, but it was very effective in getting citizens to do what they wanted them to do, even as they violated their rights. And this really pertains to what Chris was talking about with the Koper curve. Can you have too much of a good thing? That curve that goes up like this and then starts to go down. Is there a point at which procedural justice maxes out and then starts to decline in its effectiveness? It's possible. We don't know. So there's a lot, I'm telling you, that we don't know yet about it. As an innovation, then, it should be treated cautiously, and many things that could go wrong. It deserves testing. in the spirit of examining some challenges of implementing procedural justice, I'd like to undertake a very brief video exercise. I'm going to show you a police, as I said, if the technology is willing, a police-citizen encounter involving a dispute between neighbors. In this situation, there are elements of danger and disorder at the scene, and engaging in procedural justice may be challenging, but perhaps also advantageous. After we view the encounter, I'd like for each of you to take just a couple of minutes to review the form, which is at the end of the presentation in your handout, entitled Procedural Justice Rating Sheet. So if you could turn to that and just take a look at it as I talk to you before we play this. It asks you to rate the officers, there are two, how they did on the four elements of procedural justice, and then give them an overall rating using what you've done with the four elements. As you look at this video, it's very different from the previous one that you've seen. There are a lot of citizens involved. This is one of those neighborhood situations that could get out of hand. Please focus on the two women who were the original complainants. One of them is wearing a blue jacket and one of them a yellow jacket. You won't have any trouble picking them out as the scene unfolds. And then as you look at this form that I've given you, the first thing I ask you to do is to rate them. And then the second thing is answer the question, if the officers had engaged in more procedural justice than they did in this film clip, would that have been a good thing? So I'm leaving open to you, in other words, acknowledging the craft as well as the science here about this. Let me just say a couple other words to set the stage for this. This is taken from Frontline, a TV show that comes on from time to time. It was filmed in Roxbury area of Boston in the 1980s. The two officers, they're plainclothes patrol officers, are Bobby Flynn and Carlos. I never caught Carlos's first name. They're going to a scene where they were originally dispatched as a knife fight. Then it turns out somebody says there's a gun, but that turns out that there really weren't any weapons present. The quality of the video is a little bit better. There are a couple of questions, a couple of spots where questions are thrown up on the screen. That was for our interview purposes. Just ignore them. It takes about 2 or 3 seconds, and they'll go away, and the thing will continue. So now I'm going to better settle for as much technology as I got to work. Okay, please take a minute or two to do your ratings. Yeah. Thanks. Treat them as a team. Okay, in the interest of time, why don't we pause here and proceed. Before I ask for a show of hands on ratings, let me just ask, how many of you, by show of hands, have been sent to a situation like this at some point in your career? Almost everybody, okay. Very good. So we have a lot of experience here. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay, so Well, first, let's just look at your, in the interest of time, let's look at your overall procedural justice score. And there were 3 options, so I hope you marked just one of them. How many would rate the way the officers performed as good, by a show of hands? 1? Okay. How many would say satisfactory? Okay, thank you. And how many would say unsatisfactory? Okay. This is very similar to the reactions to the this video when I showed it last May to a bunch of command staff. The distribution was very similar. A little bit more negative. There weren't there were fewer satisfactory and no good ratings in that particular one. In some sense, well, here, let's hear first. Sorry, I'm used to wandering. Let's hear first from the people who said that it really wasn't satisfactory. What did you not like about it in the way that they did procedural justice? Could I hear from somebody? Yes.
I don't think the situation ever got put in a place where you could implement procedural justice.
Okay, his comment was that it really wasn't put in a place where procedural justice could have been enacted. Do you have any sense of what they could have done to get it in that place?
Well, I mean, you had several people there that, on both sides, that were the instigators. The one that threw the brick and the other one that threw the shoe. So obviously, if you can get them to sort of control, that can hopefully de-escalate that situation. And then you can sort out everything and then
Okay, so basically get the 2 antagonists who are most antagonistic apart, sort of basic procedural, police procedure in dealing with disputes like this. Okay, anybody else? Anybody else have anything to say about what was lacking in procedural justice here? Those of you who felt it was unsatisfactory? Hold on just a second, we'll give you a mic.
It was a lack of communication. They didn't explain what they were doing or why they were doing it or what the outcome was, and I don't think the situation actually was resolved other than arresting one party involved. It was actually the initial complaint.
So you're saying basically on every one of those things they really didn't hit, but particularly why are we here, what are we looking for? This is as far as we know, this is a serious situation, right? They didn't communicate that so that the community would get a sense of the officer's sense of danger and urgency, much less listening to the citizens, getting them maybe separated so you could hear them and give them a sense you will have a chance to tell your side of the story, but that never happened. Okay. How about the people who thought that they did a satisfactory or better than satisfactory job? Anybody want to comment about that on behalf of these officers? You're going to stand up for them? I will. Okay. Because I think a case can be made.
With just 2 of them and 20 people that they're having to deal with, they didn't have the resources available to do it. All they could do was either pull back and wait for backup, which that didn't appear to be the option because now you've got the complaints running up the street, or do exactly what they did. The first time they stopped it, they threw their guns on him first. As you heard, they apologized to him. We're sorry. You're the wrong guy. So, but once the complaints came up and then started instigating the fight, they were left with no choice but to either back out or wait back out.
Okay, thank you. So there's a case to be made on that side. We could go on and on about this, and this is maybe not the best environment with a very large group, but one of the points that I'd like to make is to really to underline what James was saying earlier, that from our perspective it might be very helpful for people who have to do this work to talk about it, because there are there's not as much disagreement on, but I'll bet you if I had used the one that James did, there'd be a lot of disagreement on whether or not procedural justice was used and whether it should have been used more or less. And that, I guess, is one question for you. Is there anybody in here who thinks that any attempt at doing more procedural justice than the officers did would have, in some sense, been a bad thing. Yes?
I think they were at the point where talking calmly and nice wasn't working. I credit the officers for taking.
Okay, so just because they may not be able to hear you, this gentleman is saying that at this particular point, it was beyond the capacity of the officers to talk calmly, nicely, to engage in all those things that you want. One of the things that I've done a fair amount of street-level observation, and I've always been fascinated by the challenge of dealing with people who are mentally maybe not seeing the world in a normal way, maybe paranoid, schizophrenic, in some way mentally incapacitated. And I always thought that it was particularly challenging to communicate to those people the kinds of procedural justice things that we're talking about, because some people just don't see things the same way. Yes?
I can agree with that to a certain extent, but a lot of those people, to me, seem like their character flaws. They're rude and they're assholes, and they're so self-absorbed that they don't want to listen anyway.
So again, if you couldn't hear, that the people who, in this particular situation, had character limitations, character flaws that you couldn't overcome. An alternative explanation might be that they're just very caring about what's going on, right? They're very invested. To say they're very emotional, and we all know what that can do. Well, I don't want to, we could dwell on this. I could show you a lot of other videos, too, and we could probably get into some pretty interesting discussions. Let me just point out a couple of things about the popularity of procedural justice. Based on a national survey, we haven't, this is so fresh that we haven't even reported it on the National Police Research Platform, which is a group of researchers who I'm working with. We're working with 100 different agencies around the country, gathering data on all kinds of things about police officers and people in the organization and how they're performing and so on. And we asked officers about procedural justice, nearly 12,000 of them. And as you can see from the figures here, there's a lot of support for the idea of procedural justice in a pretty large sample of American policing. It goes up slightly if you ask first-line supervisors such as yourselves, and even a little bit higher for upper-level managers. Now, mind you, this is the idea of procedural justice, and as we all know, the devil is in the details. In this room already, we have a variety of perspectives on what the officer should have done to advance procedural justice, or whether it even could have been done. So there's a lot of work that can be done yet. Just because people are on board with the concept doesn't mean that we have everything resolved. One of the things that we have tried to do to advance, to help all of you understand a little bit better about what's going on, is to go out and observe police officers on the beat, doing whatever they do on general patrol, including, obviously, their interactions with the public. And we did this in a couple of departments that had 100 or more sworn. And of the 4 procedural justice elements that I mentioned to you earlier, they scored highest on participation. Now, this probably makes sense, doesn't it? It's obviously, even if the officer doesn't give 2 hoots about the citizen's opinion, they often want information. And so they're going to ask, and you're going to get the citizen's perspective. So that scored pretty high. Scoring the lowest was showing trustworthy motives. The officers didn't do that nearly so frequently or nearly as extensively or intensively. And in the middle were dignity and neutrality. So and these 2 departments tracked pretty closely in terms of the patterns, so they're pretty similar. So if you were interested in increasing procedural justice in these 2 departments, it might not be the same in others, you might want to emphasize a little bit more on helping officers understand how to convey trustworthy motives. And I can give you one example that I've observed where a driver was pulled over, and it's a very simple thing. The officer said, I mean, we know this officer says at the end, you know, you need to be safe out there. Now, sometimes it's said with irony after the citizen got the ticket. But often, I mean, if it's conveyed properly, it indicates that the officer cares about that citizen and anybody else on the road. Or the officer who told the driver that, you know, you really ought to be careful driving in this neighborhood because there are no sidewalks and you don't want to hit any of these kids playing. So don't, you know, you want to be careful. Again, in this case, showing care and concern about you, I'm sure you wouldn't want to hit one of those kids. So something as simple as that takes 2 or 3 seconds to do. How did these departments score overall? We had a procedural justice scale. I'm not going to get into all the technicalities of that, but they scored slightly below the middle. What does that mean? I mean, when you're at university, usually 50% doesn't get you a passing grade, does it? It does in my courses oftentimes. If you're right half the time, I think you're doing pretty well. In fact, this is one of the things we don't know, what that means. 50% compared to another department may be fabulous or may be good enough because we don't have the Koper curve equivalent for procedural justice. Chris needs to start studying this, I guess, in any event. So I'm going to really not get into this except to raise these issues because Chief Aiden, I think, is going to go into these in much greater detail. But if you decide that you're interested or your department decide that it's interested in advancing procedural justice, here are some issues that I think you're going to need to deal with. Recruitment. What kind of people are good at procedural justice and how important should that be in our recruitment and selection process? Training. You can talk theory all day long to people, and this includes academics, but ultimately people's understanding and appreciation for something comes out of practice. And so the kinds of things that James was recommending, I also endorse for this kind of thing, which is that we need to generate training that is very practical and hands-on. Doesn't mean that it can't be informed by science, by scientific research, but that the training itself needs to be hands-on. Supervision, I think it's, at least in my experience, from a distance, you will have much better knowledge of this than I, but that there's a difference between supervising somebody fairly new to policing and the old hands, who are, some of whom know how to do this better than you do, and others who are not the least bit interested, and your job is to get everybody on board. So how do you teach old dogs new tricks? Monitoring performance. This is difficult based on what James said, except with the body cameras, you may have an opportunity to be able to review performance and discuss it in a constructive and positive way and learn from experience. And finally, does the community have a role to play in this? And it may in terms of helping develop your training, but also in terms of do the police need to try to educate the community on procedural justice? Procedural justice is a two-way street. It's nice to get reciprocity the other way. So with that, I'll conclude and leave it to Chief Aiden to work out all the difficult details. Thank you.